And
Uh-oh.
welcome to TG2Chat Live, the live stream series of Teachers Going Gradeless. In today's episode, we have the privilege to talk to Natalie Vardabasso. Yay, Natalie Vardabasso is an instructional design and assessment specialist at Calgary Academy, a special education private school in Alberta, Canada. Mm-hmm. She's the host of the EduCrush podcast, where she talks to educators, innovators, leaders, and activists who are reimagining education. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Spaces. Spaces is a very easy to use digital platform tool to document students' growth in and outside the classroom. Please check them out. Tell them that we sent you. Erin and I have been talking to people there and are really excited about the platform that they built and are continuing to build. And it's a great way to facilitate the gradeless approach. I'd also like to put it out there that if I don't forget at the end of the show, I'm going to do it again, is that we have a drawing that I announced like shortly before this episode, and I'm going to post it right now. It is a shortened link, bit.ly/ and this is case sensitive, TG2 drawing. Okay, so capital T, capital G, 2, capital D, drawing is where you will go, and you will simply enter your email address, and we will follow up with you if you are destined to receive some merch.
Ooh,
which I am sporting right now. And it's looking like a t-shirt tonight is what we'd like to give people. So we definitely want to see people wearing our stuff. Anyways, welcome, Natalie. Long time no see. Actually, I did see you. I saw you in cyberspace recently.
Yeah, on Sunday.
When you so ably co-moderated TG2Chat on inclusive assessment with Patty Forster, the great Patty Forster. And it was just off the chain. I mean, it was just explosive chat, and it was very difficult to keep up with, but there's so much gold there as I've been going back through it. So what was your experience? That was your first time hosting for us. You've done stuff with us before, but what were your takeaways from that chat?
Oh, fire, just straight fire. Like you were mentioning. I find that being from a special ed context, whenever these things come up, all my colleagues, my tweeps, if you will, that are also on Twitter, they tend to come out in full force and have a lot to say as well. And I'm just so excited whenever we talk about inclusion, it often pulls out a lot of the special ed folks into the conversation. And I think that is such a valuable perspective to looking at mainstream education and thinking about how we might approach it differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, that has been such a great perspective that you've been bringing for us. Before we jump in, I also wanted to take a moment and revel in our two badass Italian names up there on the screen.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty beautiful.
They are beautiful. To say. Bellissimo, if you will.
Yeah, bellissimo. Yeah, you don't see that enough. And so I just have to ask you, first of all, where's your family from?
We're from Northern Italy, so up Trieste.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and for anyone who can't pronounce my last name, I'm going to give you a tip right now. Okay. If you switch the B and the D, it's Vardabasso, and it's really easy to remember at that point, but it's Vardabasso.
Vardabasso.
Yeah, Vardabasso.
Okay, and I've heard that you're interested in etymology, so what does it mean?
Yeah. Do you know what? Apparently, because there's not many of us in the world, and I only know this because someone from Australia reached out to my parents like 20 years ago, and they're like, I've been doing all this research, and as it turns out, it means to look down, and which sounds a little judgy.
Okay.
But it had to do with geography. So I guess the family had lived on this hill, and the name had to do with looking down on others below the hill. But hopefully it has nothing to do with my character. I would hope.
No, not at all. I have a similar name. My name means clear valley, so kind of looking down in the valley. I think that would be very much the case. And I've actually had a chance to visit it. It is up on a mountainside where my grandparents are from. So,
so cool.
Yeah. So thank you for that. But you've been a luminary in the universe of TG2 for a while now. And I think your message became all the more salient for us as we entered into the pandemic last year. You wrote a piece for us really addressed to mainstream education, mainstream educators. Welcome to special ed. And I wanted to ask you, what did you mean by that? And what was the opportunity that you saw in that moment that we're still going through right now?
So that was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, because in the special ed context, I mean, in the mainstream context, special ed exists as a place to kind of sort those who are disabled into, so that we can get back to the teaching to the norm. But in the special ed context, we try to recognize that there's no disabled people, there's only disabling contexts, especially when we talk about something like a learning disability. So for me, I came up with that title because we had just entered this pandemic where all of these things that used to make the educational experience just taken for granted, like things like grading and things like, the expectation that you can assign all this homework and that kids will have all the materials they need. Suddenly, all of that was up for debate and we couldn't do the things we used to do. And so in many ways, the traditional approach to schooling itself became disabled because of this new context. And so it was my way of saying, don't worry, I promise learning still exists when the context changes. It's just us that have to respond differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Now I don't want to say we're on the other side of this, because we're not, but I think we're beginning to transition back into some more, sort of in-person experiences. And I wonder, as you look back on that, and I think that there were some other voices that were saying that same thing. We also had Dr. Sheldon Akins, who was on the show, and Leanne Jung, I think, was, saying some similar things around that. Had a lot of voices bringing that kind of insight to our attention. What do you think? So we're kind of getting out, hopefully, on the other end of things. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Have you seen any kind of changes in that mainstream that make you feel optimistic about our future moving forward? Or do you feel, some disappointment as we kind of retrench back to what we've done before?
I think one indicator of we haven't actually changed as much as I hoped we would is this narrative that's happening right now around learning loss. For me, the fact that we just had an entire population of human beings, adults and kids, that lived through a pandemic, that had to readjust every aspect of their life and learn quickly and understand school completely differently, and suddenly understand their mental health completely differently, and the role of other people in there. Like, there was so much learning that just happened. And for us to now go back to this quote unquote normal and say, okay, well, we have to make up for all that learning loss, shows me that we haven't learned our lesson, that learning is more than what a curricular pacing guide tells us it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to get into, this idea more generally, that you've been interested in assessment as playing kind of a major role in that. And I hear that a little bit in the assigning of homework. Of course, we had kind of like some institutions going test optional. There were some things around assessment that kind of changed, at least temporarily, during the pandemic. But you've really seen that, I think, even prior to that point, as key to a lot of what you're interested in terms of equity, in terms of inclusion. You're also very interested in innovation and creativity and being able to foster that in classrooms. What is that connection? Because, I mean, it seems like, why not just like go for the equity, go for the inclusion, go for the innovation? But you really see a assessment and more humane and more equitable assessments as being the key to unlock that. When did that kind of realization happen for you, and what was the insight there?
I think for me, it was the reflecting I did around purpose. So what is the purpose of assessment, and really sitting with that and trying to understand it, and then starting to do a lot of reading. And I came to the conclusion, like many of you have in this space too, that the purpose of traditional assessment is very much a sorting function. It always has been, and it still serves that purpose. When we look at, especially as students move into high school, we're trying to get that, nice distribution so we can take the cream off the top and make sure those students get into university. So for me, when we're talking about inclusion and equity, I mean, sorting in and of itself is an exclusionary practice. It's like, we are here, you are here. So if that is the purpose of assessment, and it clicked for me that that's the thing that has to change to say, oh, wait, actually, we're all welcome here. We are all in this space to learn. And the highest levels, the deepest levels maybe of learning for all is the goal, not making sure we're just getting the best of the best and doing these standardized means of sorting out the rest.
Right.
Yeah.
And how do you see special ed as giving us some insights in the way that assessment is done? So, I mean, I get that, you've been part of, I think, a lot of waves of grading reform and maybe standards-based learning grading, proficiency-based grading, I think is sort of one that we both have in our background. How do you think that special ed even takes us maybe a step further? Because I mean, I know you talk in an amazingly good talk when it comes to grading reform. You are very comfortable within, I think, those grading reform circles. But what does special ed have to tell us about assessment and that narrative around student, that conversation with students that is so much more than just numbers?
I think the biggest awareness for me is, and I want to first make it so clear that when we talk about special ed, there's these paradigms, that if students in special ed, that they have that label that's now tattooed upon them, they are special ed, and they have extremely jagged profiles. So when we talk about special ed, it usually just means that there is a significant challenge in one area. But it's the word disability that really gets me. And I think there's a personal connection to it for me because my brother was born with severe disabilities. He can't walk, he can't talk, he requires adult full-time care. And I'm like, there are things he cannot do. So when I entered the special ed space and heard the word disability and saw these very able-bodied, affluent, socially aware, curious kids, I was like, this is disability, like help me understand this. And so what the big insight for me was okay, so they have all of these incredible abilities, but perhaps they have a really significant written expression output. They have dysgraphia, they go to pick up a pencil specifically, and there's such a block to getting the words on the page. However, you quickly realize that they can still do all kinds of things, and it really becomes the challenge upon us as the designers and as the creators of that environment to ensure that the learning continues. And that's a very different stance than I think most mainstream education takes, where it's like, I'm going to deliver the activity, and the activity today is to do a concept web. And everyone's going to do a concept web, and you put the pencil into that kid's hand, and this challenge becomes the only thing that is happening in that moment. And it's like, oh, well, they probably need to go to special ed. And so it's just a very different way of thinking about things, as opposed to making it a standardized idea of how we teach and what those tasks are, versus going, the standardized idea is that everyone is diverse. So if that is the case, then we're going to have to find these diverse means of unlocking their learning and allowing them the chance to show their learning. And so for me, that's the biggest takeaway, is recognize that it's on us as designers to figure out how to create that space for them to show their learning.
So how can you give us a sense of how that is done? So, taking a traditional assessment that is exclusive, that does prevent people from showing what they know, how can teachers design assessment to be more inclusive? And I hesitate to say assessments, because then it makes it seem like just different assignments someone might choose, but just sort of a different approach to this whole concept of assessment. Where does a teacher begin as they look at their assessments and want to design an assessment ecology that is more inclusive and that allows students to find those different ways of expressing their learning?
Exactly. I think first and foremost is getting extremely clear on what the learning goals are. And it's funny, when I started into this work and into the space, that's something it clicked for me early on. And I'm realizing that it sounds very for some people, that might just be really obvious. Like, what are they learning? That's what we do as teachers. We talk about the learning. But for a lot of people, I think just based on the paradigms of how school felt for them, that's a very complex thing, to actually describe the learning. And if you describe the learning, then the tasks become variable. So for me, that's step one. And then a key next step is to understand your students, to understand who's coming into that space, because I've made this mistake firsthand many times where we say, oh, we're just going to liberate all these students. And here's this learning goal. We are going to build a community of readers who are passionate about books. Go forth. And then these kids are like, I have no idea. I don't know what. So we also have to understand the kids to understand, in terms of the ecology you're talking to, the kinds of options perhaps that you could lead them into or maybe guide them through so that they start to build their own toolkit. Because also another thing that happens if we don't think about building that toolkit for the specific learners that you have in front of you is, you say, okay, we're going to practice communicating an argumentative idea using really compelling evidence, as opposed to saying this is our essay unit. Kids have been doing essays and written responses for, potentially 12 years. And you say, go forth, what would you like to do? And suddenly they all turn in an essay. And you're like, oh, oops, that didn't work. So the ecology has a lot to do with like that navigating the space between what are the learning goals, and hopefully they're compelling that it makes people really want to get to them. And then who are my learners and what are the ecology of options that I can create and help them to understand so they can start to have some choices at their own disposal.
Absolutely. I wanted to remind people who are here that you are welcome to put a question into the stream, either on Facebook or on YouTube, and we will get to some of those questions at the end. Feel free to just chime in at any point. So I wanted to kind of follow up on that moment at which you kind of lay this out for the students, and there's just blank stares. I think that many of us who think of ourselves as these liberators, who are going to come into classrooms and just like free the children, have had that experience, just tell me what to do. It's like school doesn't need to be that end all be all for me. I mean, when I think about it from the standpoint of a teenager, it's like, this is not that cool. Like I'm going to go, I'm going to go skateboard after school. I'm not looking to school to provide that like opportunity to pursue my passion.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we've all experienced that. And I feel like there's a need to differentiate. There's almost like a scale or a continuum in terms of a student's ability to really like jump into that feet first, and at the same time, I don't want to perpetuate this reliance on the teacher as, okay, I got to go figure out how to do a podcast so that I can teach the kids to do podcasts and lead them along and kind of inspire them along the way. When, all I've done is I've taken sort of a 21st century skill and replaced that 20th or 19th century skill, but I'm still pulling the wagon. And I wonder if you have any insight in terms of that sort of differentiation in terms of where you find students who are ready to jump into that opportunity that you provided. And then those students who are just like, this is not what school is for me. Like, I don't need that. And I would prefer that you just give me a worksheet.
For me, I always rely on the aspect of our humanity being that we are such social creatures. And I think there is value in the shared experience. So yes, if you leave it super open-ended, you might not see that like liberation that you're looking for, but sometimes we can design learning experiences where learning to create a podcast is the shared experience. Just like I operate more in the literacy side of things, and there's value in a shared text. I think we talk a lot about, we want to do lit circles and have these diverse text sets. So there's choice and voice and lots of independent reading, which is awesome. But I have seen really compelling firsthand and also researched evidence for starting with that shared text. Building that engagement with reading and talking about books and talking about ideas as a group first to build a bit of that group cohesion. And then if you start to open it up for a little bit more diverse demonstrations of learning later in the year, you've already got a bit of that social buy-in happening to the group. So if you have most of the kids be like, oh, I'm so fired up about this book, I want to read it, and it's a lit circle, and kids have a choice, that kid who maybe at the beginning of the year, if you left it open-ended, would be like, not a reader, no thank you, gonna go skateboard, would be like, okay, well, they're into it, and like, I had fun in that first one. We all went through that together. I learned a lot. I'll give it a try. So I think being very intentional about how you're building the community in the classroom first, to make people want to be a part of that group experience. But also, I think it builds a little bit more safety to make choices. I mean, when we talk about going gradeless, one of the hugest reasons why is that ability to take risks and that ability to feel more free in your learning. And sometimes I think when we see kids show up and be like, oh, I just don't care. There's definitely some defense mechanism going on there from past experiences in school where we've all been there as humans. It's easier to reject to protect yourself than it is to throw yourself in there and potentially get burned or hurt. So being very cognizant of that, I think, is a good way to build towards a place. And we have to do it every year. That's what it comes down to too, is I wish we could pretend it's going to be this consistent experience for kids where it's all about the learning and these clear learning goals, but it's not. And so every single year they're coming into the classroom, looking at the teacher being like, what's up with you? What are you all about? And it takes a while to earn the trust of kids in a system that is literally built on power over structures and traditional hierarchies. And so it takes time is the short answer. And start with the shared experience to build the community. Be my main advice.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something in there that definitely really resonated with me is, I think, especially in terms of building that trust, as we come out of this pandemic, but out of so many other disruptions that I think some of our students have experienced, there's a fair amount of trauma that students have experienced. And then there are other students who may be ready and feel ready and willing to move forward with, a certain amount of open-endedness. That's a concern that I have too, is that who are the people who are able to access that very open-ended sort of freewheeling experience that we put out for them. And I feel like sometimes the calls for project-based learning and genius hour and just, throw it all the wind and what do you want to do is, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that when you've experienced trauma, you've a lot of times been rocked back to the very basics. And so for our eye to be on that student who is most able to engage with this very open-ended free experience is probably not where we need to be paying most attention. I think especially as our kids are coming back to us, having struggled through this pandemic, I think a lot of them are not ready to engage with that level of freedom. I don't want to say that they need to be herded through their education, but at the same time, how are we keeping an eye on those students and being careful to moderate those, those sort of very open-ended experiences where there aren't any guardrails really for them.
Exactly. I think that is such a. I think it points out in our own humanity too this binary bias that is always there. And I mean, in education, people talk about it like, oh, the pendulum, it swings back and forth, which that one always gets me. But when we're talking about creating inclusive, liberating learning experiences, it's not like literally go off and do your own thing and like be free or like we're in rigid rows, like authoritarian lockdown. Like there is this space in between where we can be negotiating that shared whole group experience while also allowing for that diversity to be honored and upheld at the same time. And it's messy. And I wish there was a playbook to be like, you just do these things. But like we're in a relational job and it's co-created every single year, every single week, every single day. And that's what makes this job so amazing. And I think why we all love it and stick in it for so long. But it's also what makes it sometimes frustrating. So you're like, I just want answers. How do I get this right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right that there's no way of simplifying that need for relationship and for dialogue and for co-creating that experience, which is going to be different every year and it's going to be different with every kid. So I wanted to get to something a little bit more timely now, kind of as our last little discussion here, but learning loss. There's a lot of talk about learning loss, and I think that it's been widely criticized and panned by educators, and rightly so. But I think, I guess I want to get your opinion on that, and just how you're seeing that or not seeing that, and your thoughts on that. I honestly think that there's something to it. I'll just talk about one of my experiences with, I am an administrator. I'm not a special educator, but I know that special education has a lot of diagnostics that happen as part of it. And I have to tell you, I'm privy to some of that. And when I see a student who has a diagnostic that says that they have a grade equivalency, this is high school, of 3.3, basically third of the way through third grade in math, I really do start thinking about triaging that situation and stripping everything down to the basics and having a laser-like focus. And this kid has, they've experienced whatever disruption through the pandemic, but probably many other disruptions leading up to this point, where their less disrupted peers are actually at grade level. And I feel like, even as a teacher going gradeless who would just throw those numbers out, I have to look at that and feel somewhat responsible for that. So I'm wondering, kind of balancing those two things. I think as a special educator, seeing these students come back where they're at, and then also just being in special ed in general, how do you look at that? How do you make sense of that? And where do you kind of fall on the topic of learning loss right now?
Yeah, I feel like you're actually talking more about like the concept of remediation, more so than learning loss. And that's something I know quite well from my context. And, it's something I've struggled with on and off for years, because I've seen where it can hold students back just by the basis of focusing so intensively on deficits that it starts to erode their self-efficacy. And then they start to just define themselves by that deficit. And the debate that we get into in my context often is it a remediation problem or is it an accommodation problem? Like, how do we, at this point, balance making sure that we are giving them the tools and skills they need to potentially close that gap versus giving them the accommodations and the universal designs so that they can fully engage? And I find lately I'm falling more on the side of universal design. So do the diagnostic. Absolutely. I'm a big fan of that. We are currently doing a literacy benchmark diagnostic for all of our high school students for the first time this year. Really excited about that. Performance-based. That's another tip I'll give you. Beware these tools that offer really, really quick, accurate diagnostics, because I've found over the years, like there's I'll call it out. There's one called STAR, created by Renaissance. There's STAR Reading, STAR Math. From using it for years, I was humiliated as a teacher because it was our go-to tool for a little bit. And the data would be all over the place. So you would see one test that would say 3.3, but then the next one says 9.8. And then all you have are these data points, and you're sitting with a parent in a graph trying to magically pull an explanation of what it all means out of the air. So I'm a big believer in do the diagnostic, but make sure it's meaningful, and make sure whatever the constructs are that are being assessed, you have a deep understanding, and the assessment tool paints a picture of what is either missing or what next steps are, so that you can have that conversation with parents and with the student. I fall more on the side of universal design, but that being said, it can be incredibly powerful when a student is brought into that shared experience. They still feel they're a part of class. They still feel they're a learner with strengths that can be supported and amplified in that space, but they're also being recognized for something that maybe they've been embarrassed to talk about. And it's in a safe one-on-one way to help them to have more and more tools to come back to that classroom space. We've been trying something different this year, actually, and it's been really fun to watch it unfold, where our remediation specialists that used to work one-on-one, they've actually been coming into the classroom. And so they'll do the diagnostic, take the evidence, determine what would be a really beneficial remedial thing that student would need, and they just come in and teach it to the whole class.
Right.
And I found that's been really fascinating, because it's never going to hurt the student who's doing really well and is at grade level, this mythical grade level.
Right.
Maybe going back and understanding the prefixes and suffixes of word. If you're an etymology nerd like me, you'd just be like, oh, cool. I like talking about this stuff. It's interesting.
Right.
Whereas for a kid who's really struggling to decode, it's like, remembering them to break down word parts, and that you do know some of these parts, and to build from what you know to try and piece it together. And so that's been a really interesting approach. Another approach I've heard recently is actually from, I had a great conversation last night with Sarah Zerwin, author of Pointless.
Oh, nice. Yes.
She's brilliant. And she mentioned she had observed something called Shark Week. And I was so excited about it. And shout out, Sarah. I hope she doesn't mind sharing this. But it was a group of algebra teachers in high school who realized they had this gateway course, and they had to be so cognizant of whatever gaps the students were bringing into that course, because it was a course that dictated all of their choices for the rest of their high school experience. So what they do is they do a diagnostic, they come together and analyze the data, and then they plan what they call Shark Week, where they triage. They take every single one of the kids and they put them into diverse groups. And then they target whatever that area is that kid really, really needs to grow in. And then they do that same diagnostic a week later to see, okay, have we made these impacts? Everyone, again, shared experience. There's power in that. So no one feels embarrassed, and no one feels like they're being marginalized or pulled out from the group. It's like, we all have things we can grow on and get better at.
Yeah.
Like
absolutely.
Math and numeracy, that's a huge, like there's constantly things to grow in, just like literacy. We can all get better. So I thought that was kind of a cool approach.
Yeah, that is really cool. And it's very thoughtful about keeping the kids all together. I think that's one of those, that's just sort of like the holy grail of being able to do that, where you don't have to have a kid go out or sit in front of a computer and work through modules or whatever else, but that you can find a way to make that still part of the larger community. And it sounds like that really preserves that and adds kind of a sense of fun to it as well.
Yeah.
So that's really awesome. Well, we are getting to the end here. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us for this episode of TG2Chat Live. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Spaces. Spaces, again, is a user-friendly digital portfolio tool to document students' growth in and outside the classroom. Erin and I have been talking with them, and we're really excited about the platform that they're building and have already built. We really think teachers going gradeless, that if you're going to attempt this whole gradeless thing, at some point you're going to need a portfolio platform, and Spaces is a great way to facilitate that. Also like to thank our Patreon supporters. Like to thank Steve Pulitzer Owls, Laura Gibbs, Bridget Bryson, Mark Phillips, Dina Lau, Corin Claver, Brian Arnault, and Skylar Prim. Thank you so much for allowing us to continue this work, helping teachers, students, and schools to grow beyond grades. And Natalie, just to finish up here, can you let us know where we can find you and what's next for you?
Yeah, for sure. Probably best place to find me is on Twitter. I'm on there a lot. So my personal Twitter handle is on the screen there, at Natabasso. And then I also host a weekly podcast called EduCrush, kind of like a play on words, because I'm talking to people that inspire me and I have a bit of an EduCrush on. So you can follow that at EduCrush Pod. And what's next?
Full disclosure, I've never been on the EduCrush podcast, so I'm not in that category.
Okay, the problem, Arthur, is that I have like a crush on everybody. Like I find educators to be some of the most inspiring humans.
That's okay.
So my problem is that I have too many interviews. I never have a
But the other meaning is that so that we're crushing it. We're crushing it, you know. So it's a little of that, and okay.
I've been called in on the language a bit with that though, where it's like, oh, that's a little bit, you know.
A little violent, a little
kind of
that war metaphor in the trenches.
Fit. Oh, you know me, and in the trenches, that gets me. Boots on the ground. Oh,
yeah, boots on the ground.
As soon as I got aligned with that, I was like, oh no, I didn't intend that.
It is a little violent, but no, I like both of the meanings. That's cool.
Cool.
And anything next for you? I mean, probably some more good podcasts coming up.
Yeah. I'm currently working through writing something. I'm moving through a big writing project right now, which really just means I got to put my butt in the chair.
Okay.
And write. That is the hardest part about it. All the ideas. I'll just leave it there. I won't tease the idea too much, but we're taking a few different unlike things and trying to draw a parallel.
I already know what the name of the book is, though.
Do you?
assessment is learning. I heard it in the Twitter chat. You heard it here first. Assessment is learning by Natalie Vardabasso.
That's it. Copyrighted. Don't take it.
Don't take it. Don't you dare take that. Okay. So yes, definitely check her out on EduCrush podcast and on Twitter. She has wonderful takes and just blesses us on Twitter all the time with her thoughts. So once again, Natalie, we are just huge fans. We're so glad to have you as part of our community. And I am so glad to have had the chance to talk with you finally tonight. So thank you.
Right back at you. It's so good to finally chat face to face.
Indeed. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and be sure to stay tuned for the next installment of TG2Chat Live. Actually, one more thing. Don't forget, put your name into the drawing right there, bit.ly/case sensitive, capital T, capital G, 2, capital D, rawing, and that will get you in the drawing for a t-shirt. So hopefully you will get that. And if not, just go to the store and buy one yourself. See you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.